Greeting, Gordon friends. I want to say first thank you to faculty, staff, and administration for the support given to me over the years, first as a student and then as a faculty member. And thank you for inviting me this morning to the opening convocation as we start a new series on creativity and beginnings. This morning, I want to share with you a portion of my work with the Eastern Cherokee Nation in North Carolina. There, I experienced the wonder of beginnings as I worked with the Cherokee people, an ancient culture historically known as the principal people. The experience began in 1990 when my Gordon College sabbatical time allowed me to go to Cherokee. There, I met the Bushyhead family and became a part of their great effort to implement a program of language restoration in the schools. Most of the children and adults spoke only English, having been forcibly denied their native language as part of the enculturation process. Today, we recognize the historic injustices done to the Native peoples, and language restoration programs are encouraged. For me, it was a joy to become a part of the restoration and preservation of the ancient language, working toward healing the terrible wrongs of the past. The 2 Cherokee books that I wrote while there were a small scene from the greater picture of the language program. Here's how my stories came to be. One day, I heard the beloved elder, Reverend Robert H. Bushyhead, tell a story from his oral history, a story that he had first heard as a child some 80 years earlier, as the storytellers would visit his mountain cabin. I listened to his story and was deeply moved. It needed to be shared. I asked Mr. Bushyhead if he would like for me to try to write it as a children's story and includes several Cherokee words from our curriculum. Now, I had never written a children's book, but at that moment, nothing seemed impossible. So, with Mr. Bushyhead's permission and the encouragement of my sabbatical committee, I embarked on a new journey and wrote Yonder Mountain, a Mountain Legend. I want to share that process with you and also introduce to you my second Cherokee story, also from Mr. Bushyhead's oral history, Curious One. And lastly, I want to tell you about a Florida adventure that I'm currently involved in, an adventure that has led me on a different journey with writing and storytelling. But right now, let's pause for a moment and let you meet Mr. Bushyhead and listen to his words and catch the spirit of his life.
My name is Robert H. Bushyhead. I was born in the Birdtown community of the Qualla boundary on October the 29th, 1914. My mother, my daddy, my brother, and myself, we lived in this one-room cabin. And it was primitive, but yet, back in those days, all was in a primitive stage. And we were happy in this little home that we had there. This little cabin, I remember, had a fireplace in one end of it which served many purposes. My mother cooked on it, everything she cooked was cooked on the fireplace. And then she had pots and pans suitable to bake bread or to boil bread or whatever she needed to do. The fire never went out at any time. And part of that was because of the fact that the fire was very, very sacred and never allowed to burn out. And then the fireplace made light for us at night as we sat around the room. And even when friends came by to tell stories, we would listen to their stories as they told about their ancestral past, and as they told legends and their experiences even they talked about. And so we listened to the stories sitting in the light of the fireplace. The fireplace was also used for heating. We heated our house, for we had no other way of heating the house, so we had to keep the fire in the fireplace. And then the shaman, the medicine men, and others who came to heal us when we became sick used the hot coals from the fireplace and used them as a part of their medication. And as they read their formulas, they talked to the Great Spirit and used the hot coals to apply hot hands to the place where we were hurting. We had a way of life there that was peaceful. We had a life there that was very, very serene. One morning, I suppose about mid-morning, my mother came into the room and said, "There's someone coming up the trail. Someone is coming up the trail." And the alarm in her voice told us that it was someone we had never seen before. During this legend-telling time, they told us about the white man. I had never seen one. They told us that he was the one that moved the Cherokees by force from their homes and drove them away to the west. They told of how many children died on that trail of tears. They told us how many old folks died along the trail of tears. They told us how that those who were already sick, as they left their homeland, died along the trail of tears. Somehow listening to those stories told by the older ones who came to our home to tell stories, I began to create a little hate in my heart for the white man, even though I had never seen one. But yet, this morning, my mother, with alarm in her voice, tells us that somebody is coming up the trail. We ran to the wall where we had knocked a chinking out to make a makeshift window and looked down the trail, and sure enough, 2 people were coming up the trail. They were not Indians. They were white people. White people? White people. They didn't look like I had imagined them to be. When I heard about a white man, I would think of him as being a man, white from the top of his head to the bottom of his feet. Yet here they were, had clothes on, coming up. They didn't look like I had imagined a white man would look. Then they came to the door. My daddy talked with the man on the outside. I learned later that he was J.N. Lee, and this old lady with him was Mrs. Lee, missionaries to the Cherokees in North Carolina. When Mr. Lee stopped on the outside to talk to my daddy, Mrs. Lee came right on in, and my brother led me to the darkest corner in the house and took a seat in front of me as though to protect me, only 3 years older than I was. As we sat there, Mrs. Lee came into the house. She was not heavy, she was real light, and she was wrinkled, and she had white hair, and she had spectacles on. And to me, I had never seen anything like that in my life before. To me, she was the most ferocious looking thing I had ever seen. And yet, when she came, when she spoke, her tone, the tone of her voice, told volumes and volumes more about how she cared for us. She was not our enemy. Just the tone of her voice told us that.
Some of you might be wondering, and certainly school children asked me once when I showed them this video, if I was Mrs. Lee. So I had to assure them that that was a little bit before my time. But that's a story, that's another story for another day. But now let's go ahead and talk about preserving and restoring their language. It was Mr. Bushyhead's final mission. He was a self-made linguist and one of the few Cherokee speakers in their nation. When I met him, he suffered from hearing loss, diabetes, leg amputations, blindness, and heart attacks. As he said when recording the Cherokee language sounds, "Get everything you can from me while I am here." And that's what we did. Our 12-hour days were filled with recording the sounds of the language, preparing grants, meeting with teachers, writing and recording lessons, checking words with speaking elders, and finally implementing the language lessons in the classroom. One day, the school psychologist who was working with second graders asked them, "Are you Indian?" Now, most of the children were confused and didn't know how to answer. Little Jesse went home that day and asked his mother, "Am I Indian?" His mother assured him that he was Cherokee. Soon after the Cherokee lessons were begun in his classroom, Jesse came home and told his mother, "I feel Cherokee when I talk it." There were many reasons to restore their ancestral language and their culture. Certainly, self-concept was high on the list. Now let's go back to our conversation about the writing and publishing process. After hearing Mr. Bushyhead's story and getting his permission to write it, we settled on the title, Yonder Mountain. We named the characters decided which Cherokee words to include, and then I wrote the manuscript. I checked and rechecked with Cherokee folks, especially the Cultural Committee, to ensure that each concept and illustration were culturally and historically accurate. I ran into many challenges, but that's a story for another day too. All of this background work was very important, and I realized it fully upon receiving Principal Chief Joyce Dugan's words. Here's what she said. There are many books about the Cherokees out there, but you have captured the essence of that part of us so often overlooked or completely missed, and that is the gentleness and the wisdom of our legends. This is what I want portrayed about us. As I began the process of self-publishing Yonder Mountain, I didn't know how I would fund the printing and artwork for the book. Expenses were mounting up, and I figured about $13,000 would cover it all. I thought, if all else fails, I'll pay for it from my savings. Well, my husband was less sure about that whole financial picture, but we forged ahead. And the Lord provides, as we know, in strange and mysterious ways. And his angels appear in various forms. One day, late in my office, I was about to leave over in Jenks when a man appeared at my door. My first thought was, oh no, a book salesman. But then as I calmed down and listened to him, he introduced himself. He was from the College Development Office and wanted to know if any of us in the Education Division had projects that needed funding. Did I have a project? He was headed for Pennsylvania the next morning to talk to a couple who had established a foundation to promote active learning in schools, and they wanted to involve Gordon personnel. He encouraged me to write up my project, get it to him quickly, and he would present it the next day. Well, to make a long story short, Yonder Mountain Project was accepted and funded for $13,000. The original Yonder Mountain was a paperback, printed right here at Gordon College. A year later, a distributor from Marshall Cavendish of New York saw the paperback in the Children's Library in Rockport and thought that his editor might want to do a hardcover edition. It was a happy day for me when 3 months later I received a phone call in my office. Hello, Kay. This is Judith Whipple of Marshall Cavendish, and we want to publish Yonder Mountain. With the money from Yonder Mountain's Marshall Cavendish publication, we were able to help pay the salary of a Cherokee speaker to teach in the elementary schools, implementing Mr. Bushyhead's lessons. Let's see the front cover of Yonder Mountain. Here it is. This is Chief Galant Lo-E, or Chief Sky. Galant Lo-E is Sky in Cherokee. Chief Galant Lo-E pointing to Yonder Mountain. I think it's time to storytell now, but because of time constraints, I will tell only like one half of the story. The Media Center kindly will put the illustrations on the screen, which will save you from having to role play the various characters, as I usually ask school children to do. However, would you furnish a couple of sound effects just to make sure that we're on the same page? When the young men in the story, the Aniwina, when the young men climb the mountain, make slow climbing steps with your hands or feet. Want to practice? When they, oh, good, excellent. Now, when they run back, make running noises with running feet or hand noises. Okay. Hawa. When the villagers murmur, there's a point where they're going to murmur, make murmuring noises with impatient sayings. Let's get going. Hurry up. I'm getting tired of waiting. Okay. One more instruction. We're ready to start, but before I begin, I will ask you in Cherokee language if you are ready for me to begin. And if you are, you need to answer me in Cherokee. The Cherokee word for yes is Let's practice. Excellent. Hawa. Izadana Istazu? Once in the land of the Cherokee people, there lived a beloved chief called Gala-lo-e. Chief Gala-lo-e had seen many summers and many winters. He had led his people through long seasons of peace. He had seen their warriors go through great battles with their enemies. But now his step was slow and his hands trembled on the bow. He was no longer able to spot Brother Deer among the trees. He was no longer able to lead his people. One day, in the season of falling leaves, he called 3 aniwina to him, 3 young men to him, and said, "One of you will become our next chief and lead our people. But first, I must put you to the test." He turned and looked into the distance, and then he pointed to the highest peak, and he said to the aniwina, "Do you see yonder mountain?" And they said, "Yes, we see the mountain." And the chief said, "I want you to go to the highest peak. Bring back to me what you find there." Now the first Iwina, called Yona Bear, Yona started up the mountain. He climbed and climbed until the sun reached the middle of the day. Then he found a wide spot in the path, and he leaned against a rock, lay down, and rested. Just as his eyes were growing heavy, he noticed 1,000 sparkling lights sitting up straight. He picked up a beautiful stone. He turned it around and watched the sun dance on each surface. If my people had these beautiful stones, they could change them for food, and we'd never go hungry again. So Yona gathered up many stones and ran back down the mountain. Now, the villagers saw him coming, and they lined the path as Yona entered the village. "Look at the pretty stones Yona found," the children said. Yona spread the stones before his chief and said, "Look, my chief, what I have found. Beautiful stones. We can change them for food, and we'll never be hungry again." The old chief smiled fondly on the young man and said, "You have done well, my son. You have done well. Let us wait now for our next Iwina." The second Iwina, called Waya, started up the mountain. He climbed past the place of sparkling stones, and he kept going, and the path got rough and rugged and high. Finally, he found a wide place in the path, and he leaned against a tree to rest. And there he spotted herbs and plants and roots and bark of all sorts growing along the path. He reached down and he examined one of the plants and he said, "Look at the long roots and the sharp-pointed leaves. These are the healing plants of our medicine man. If we have these plants, we will never be sick again." So he gathered one of each of the plants and hurried back down the mountain. Now, the villagers saw him coming, and again they lined the path as he entered the village and ran to his chief. Waya spread the plants before his chief and said, "Look, my chief, what I found. All kinds of plants. Our medicine man can use them, and we'll never be sick again." The old chief smiled fondly on the arena and said, "You have done well, my son. You have done well. Let us wait now for our last arena, Uwahali, eagle." And so they waited, and they waited. Days went by, and Uwahali did not come. On the 6th day, they got tired of waiting, and the villagers began to murmur. "We're getting tired. Let's go, let's hurry." Chief Galan Lo'i stood before them and said, "We will wait one day longer." And so they waited. Now on the 7th day, as the sun cast its long shadow over the village, the villagers saw Uwahali coming down the pathway. His feet were bleeding, his clothing was torn, and his hands were empty. He had no gift for the chief. The villagers were quiet as Uwahali stumbled through the village and fell at the feet of his chief. We're going to stop there, okay? I hear you murmuring. I'll have to tell you that the book is available over at the library. In the curriculum library, this might be a ploy to get you over there. And also at the bookstore. Thank you for letting me stop. Okay. Now, during the signing of the first Yonder Mountain at the Museum of the Cherokee Indians, I had the privilege of sitting beside Mr. Bushyhead as people came by. He was like a rare treasure, only coming out at special occasions. During our time together that afternoon, he unexpectedly told me another story from his oral history. I quickly grabbed for anything to write on, and finding a check, I scribbled notes. Now those scribbles turned into our second story, Curious One. Just like Yonder Mountain, Curious One had never been written down before. And here we see the front cover, and we see the young girl, Curious One, or Une Lahi. I did ask Mr. Bushyhead if we could shorten her name a little bit, maybe use a nickname or something just to help us non-speakers out. But he looked at me sternly and said, "Kay, that's the way Cherokee is." And so that's the way it was. Joseph Bruchac, a member of the Abenaki Nation and a well-known writer, kindly did the forwards for each of my Cherokee books. Let's read an excerpt from his Curious One forward, where he talks about the military type assault on American Indian families where the children, by force and coercion, were sent to boarding schools. I'll read the third paragraph to you. As Joseph says, it is a miracle that any of those sent to boarding schools managed to survive, and that many found their ways to resist the destruction of their spirit. They learned about the white world, but they never forgot that they were Indian. Some 80 years ago, Robert H. Bushyhead was one of those children stuck in a boarding school and wanting to go home. Only the memory of his language, his loving family, and his culture would carry him like a great eagle with widespread wings back to his heart. He learned well about the white world, but never forgot that he was Cherokee. He never let go of his language or such seemingly simple but deeply meaningful stories as this one that is now shared in print for the first time. Now, little did Joseph know that his foreword and reference to being carried home on the widespread wings of a great eagle would arrive at my home in Gloucester, Massachusetts, on the very day that Mr. Bushyhead died. My Cherokee friend was truly carried home on eagle's wings to the Lord that he loved and served his life. Curious One was my second Cherokee book and my second step in participating in the preservation of God's creation through ancient stories. Stories that recorded the customs, values, and tradition that say gave birth to the principal people. Now let me tell you quickly about my third book, which is also my third and very different exploration into preservation. It is now a few years after my retirement from Gordon, and I spend a part of each year in Venice, Florida. One day in Venice, I met an ancient reptile, the gopher tortoise, struggling up my driveway and also struggling for survival. I found his burrow, his home, that was dug dangerously close to the street. A bit of research told me about the gopher tortoise's plight. He was recently upgraded in Florida from species of special concern to that of threatened, as he and his habitat were rapidly disappearing to development. His burrow, which was a deep, long tunnel, was shared with 360 other animals that would also be in peril if he disappeared. As I learned this historic land turtle's new story, a new children's book was born called How Gimble Gopher Tortoise Found a New Home. This is the cover of the book, showing Gimble Gopher Tortoise and 5 of his commensals, animals that also share his burrow during some part of their lifespan. In the story, all of these threatened animals lost their homes to the bulldozer, and they journeyed together to find a new place. Now let's look at page 4. Here we see Gimble Gopher Tortoise and Burrowing Owl, or Burr Owl as he is called, heading north to find a new home. This is my favorite illustration because of the hope that we can see in their faces and body posture. We don't have time to follow them on their trip, but let's look at one of the final illustrations. Here we see the end of their great journey north to a sanctuary, quote, saved by kind people for animals like us, just as Indigo Snake had promised them earlier. Upon earlier hearing Indigo Snake's words about the promise, Burr Owl had been quite skeptical, saying, "What? Humans help us?" But it was true, and the 6 travelers did find the sanctuary that had been saved for them and expressed the hope that others needing refuge would find a woodland such as this. The details of this book are for another day, but just to say it has been good, and my storytelling goes on in the schools, libraries, parks, churches, and museums of Florida. The Cherokee books Yonder Mountain and Curious One record family stories of the Cherokee. On the other hand, Gimble Gopher Tortoise tells a story of the present and features threatened animals pleading for habitat preservation. We all participate in this process of preservation. At the time, we might not even realize the spiritual implications of our efforts as we study, research, experiment, record, and share God's creation. When we explore our history, when we listen to stories, when we examine and learn about our foundational stones, we honor our God and we play a role in preserving His creation. May the wonder of this creative process be yours during your college career and as you continue your journey. Thank you.